They were the most popular rock band of the 1970s.
It was a big deal in '77 when an American band could sell 80,000 tickets.
Led by a pair of fiery and unpredictable performers.
Joe Perry and Steven Tyler were just great on stage together.
It was a marriage made in heaven.
Until a drug-fueled mid-career meltdown sent them straight to the bargain bins.
When we heard he left the band, we thought that was the end of Aerosmith.
It was unbelievable to see how they had fallen from grace so quickly.
But a music miracle gave the band a second chance at success.
We realized that if we wanted the band to work, we had to get clean.
And turned Aerosmith into the greatest rock and roll comeback story of all time.
Very few people get that once. No one really gets it twice. It's a remarkable achievement.
High decibels, hard drugs, and backstage drama. Aerosmith.
The people love Aerosmith. They love the rock and roll.
In 1979, Aerosmith was the biggest rock act in the country, but their soaring career was about to come crashing down to earth in a single night in Cleveland. Aerosmith's success had been built upon the creative but volatile partnership between frontman Steven Tyler and lead guitarist Joe Perry. But now that partnership was breaking down.
Well, as the 70s went on, tension was escalating in the band, drug use was escalating in the band.
There were, obviously the toxic twins, Joe and Steven, and they were all drinking and getting high.
Steven Tyler and Joe Perry just could not stand each other. I mean, things had just gotten bad where they didn't want to be in a room together, didn't want to work together, certainly didn't want to perform together.
Steven and Joe sometimes only communicated with each other by screaming into each other's ears on stage.
You can see that Joe's not happy. I don't know that anybody was happy at that point.
It was on July 28th, 1979, at a show in Cleveland where it kind of all came to a head.
Backstage, Steven and Joe had this huge blowout. They're at each other's throats.
We were pretty burned out, and instead of taking the vacation, we let loose on each other.
And Joe said to Steven, "Why don't I just leave the band?" Steven said right back to Joe, "Go ahead and F and go, I don't care." And so then he left the band, and he swore that he would never step on stage with Aerosmith again.
It would be remembered as one of the biggest implosions in rock history. It's the great paradox of Aerosmith. The foundations of the band are built on the passionate songwriting partnership of Steven Tyler and Joe Perry. But their clashing personalities also made for one of the most turbulent stories in music. And we know their story didn't end there. With 15 albums, 26 concert tours, and a well-deserved induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, by 2013, Steven and Joe, along with the rest of the band, became legends. Although battles with addiction and each other, injuries and solo careers threatened their stability along the way, in the end, it only made them stronger. Aerosmith, 9 lives and counting. The roots of Aerosmith begin in Yonkers, New York, where Steven Tyler was born on March 26, 1948, to parents Victor and Susan. From his early years, he seemed destined for the stage.
Victor was a very accomplished piano player who played in big bands, and so Steven comes from a very musical milieu. Steven Tyler's first professional gigs were as the drummer of his father's band.
Steven Tyler grew up with British invasion music. Bands like the Rolling Stones, like the Yardbirds. It's like the Rolling Stones were in town. He would find out what clubs they were going to and go sit behind them and watch them. He had that kind of passion about the music.
Steven was always focused on what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a rock star. He didn't want to be restricted to those drums. He wanted to be out in front dancing, and making the crowd do what he wanted to do because he knew he had that power inside him.
It would take a chance meeting some 400 miles from the big city in Sunapee, New Hampshire, to set Steven's aspirations of stardom into motion. It was there, in the summer of 1969, that Steven caught a performance by local act The Jam Band, featuring a 17-year-old Tom Hamilton on bass and an 18-year-old guitarist named Joe Perry.
We just grew up in a small town just outside of Boston, not far from Foxborough. My father was the town treasurer, and my mother was the gym teacher at the little high school. It was a pretty normal childhood. When I was around 10 or 12, my parents bought me this Silvertone acoustic, and I'd play along with songs on the radio. When the Beatles movie came out, that was one of the inspirations that made me want to actually form a band.
Watching Joe Perry play on stage, Steven Tyler had a rock and roll revelation.
Joe had the feel and the charisma and that stage presence that Steven was looking for. A guy who gets on stage, lets his hair down, and lets his music do the talking.
Steven Tyler and Joe Perry get a chance to jam together and instantly click. Joe Perry and Tom Hamilton were playing together, and they decided to move their band to Boston and it was the nearest big town and try and make it there. And Steven Tyler decided, if these are the guys I want to play with, I got to move there as well. I got to move where they're going.
In summer 1970, 22-year-old Steven Tyler joined 19-year-old Joe Perry in Boston to form Aerosmith. Joe's New Hampshire cohort, Tom Hamilton, filled in on bass. Another Yonkers boy, Joey Kramer, sat at the drums, and Ray Tabano played rhythm guitar, soon to be replaced by Brad Whitford. And they weren't just a band, they were housemates.
The band had a communal house at 1325 Commonwealth Avenue near Boston University.
It was like Animal House. The house was never empty. There was always somebody in, people coming in and out all the time. There was always a party going on.
But it wasn't all one big party. Aerosmith was working hard to become the best band in Boston. And it was there that they honed their signature sound and their flamboyant stadium-ready look.
They worked very hard to become a professional band. They started out rehearsing in a place called the Fenway Theater on Massachusetts Avenue in Boston.
Literally played to eat and live. We were always just trying to make our rent.
We were playing high schools, in clubs. We used to get paid like $125. Okay, there was 5 of us, and we had this roadie, we had a truck, we had all the equipment. After everything was paid for, we'd wind up at about 19 cents each.
In the early days, they'd play till they found some idea. Steven would say, what was that? Go work with that. Joe would go off and turn an idea into a song, put chords and a melody to it, give it some shape, and then Steven would write lyrics to that.
We were constantly under Steven's tutelage about learning some of the dynamics of how you make the song sound a little more professional.
Steven Tyler tortured their poor drummer, Joey Kramer, almost to death because Steven was a drummer himself and he wanted the thing to flow in a certain way.
But it wasn't just Joey Kramer who bristled at Steven's perfectionism. Already, the relationship between Perry and Tyler was growing tense.
I know from that first gig that they played at Nipmuc Regional High School, Steven kept telling Joe that he was playing too loud, and Joe wouldn't turn down. And at the end of the gig, Steven screamed at him, "My ears are bleeding, you've got to turn down." But Joe never wanted to turn down. He wanted to play really loud, hard rock.
I refused to go into whatever dressing room we had when the show was over because they were frighteningly explosive arguments.
Steven and Joe may have fought about the music, but together they were forging an incendiary new sound that was landing the band better gigs. And audiences were starting to take notice.
They just started touring and playing everywhere they could and started building up a regional following in New England by taking to the road in a van and playing everywhere that would have them.
Aerosmith was gaining this great reputation for having this really dynamic, energetic live show.
In spring of 1972, Aerosmith even attracted the attention of a hotshot New York City management team, Stephen Leber and David Krebs, who'd made a name for themselves handling glam rock band the New York Dolls. They were determined to get Aerosmith a major label deal.
Leber and Krebs knew that they needed to showcase Aerosmith live in New York City. It's not something that's going to come across bringing in a demo tape. They had to get them on a stage in front of people. And Max's Kansas City was, the hottest place, really the epicenter of New York rock and roll.
That was a big deal for us. Because we're basically a Boston, New England band. No one knew us outside of that neighborhood.
But the prospect of playing in front of the most powerful men in the music business was daunting.
This was their shot. They were coming to New York City. They were playing the biggest club in town. Clive Davis, who was running Columbia Records, the top executive in town, was there. If you don't have it that night, you're driving back to Boston.
The pressure was on, but Aerosmith did not disappoint.
Aerosmith got up on stage, they played their set, and they delivered, and they showed what they were capable of.
Clive was impressed. enough to take us aside and put his arm around Steven's shoulder and said, "You're going to be a big star."
These were the words that Steven Tyler had been aching to hear his entire life.
Clive Davis probably saw what we saw, like an American Stones or an American Zeppelin. But I think really people were just looking for a great American rock band, and they found one in Aerosmith.
By the summer of 1972, the band that had been scraping by on $125 a gig was signed to Columbia Records for a then astonishing sum of $125,000. But if Aerosmith thought that a recording contract would mean instant success, they were wrong. For 3 years, Aerosmith had been building a Boston fan base through hard work and relentless touring. In 1972, Columbia Records took notice, signing the band to a $125,000 recording contract. The boys from Boston seemed to be on their way to stardom. That is, until their self-titled debut was released in January 1973.
Aerosmith's first album came out and did nothing. No one played it. The single was Dream On, didn't get played on the radio. The record didn't get reviewed in Rolling Stone.
You would think that a debut album that has Dream On it would be the instant entree to rock superstardom. It wasn't. It was kind of a lukewarm reception initially.
To make matters worse, Aerosmith faced stiff competition from another debut artist.
The same week that Aerosmith's first album came out, Columbia Records also released a first album by a rock musician named Springsteen.
For every dollar that they spent on promoting Aerosmith, they spent $100 promoting Bruce Springsteen. Without any support from the label, the album didn't really do much at all.
The few critics who were paying attention compared the band to their rock idols, and they didn't mean it as a compliment.
Aerosmith was compared to the Rolling Stones, and not favorably. Steven looked a little bit like Mick. Joe looked a little bit like Keith Richards.
That's the God-given body and face they have. What are they supposed to do about it, you know? So it was just one of those things that, you know, the writers could latch on to and kicked us around for a long time.
The album was a commercial disaster, selling a scant 30,000 copies, and Columbia Records was reluctant to release a second Aerosmith album.
Clive Davis, who was at Columbia at the time, wasn't going to do it. He calls him up. He says, "We're not going to put the second record out." David Krebs, the band's manager, called up Columbia and said, "Just give us a little more time. We can build an audience on our own."
Aerosmith's management sent them on a grassroots tour that crisscrossed the nation. It was a last-ditch effort to sell the band directly to fans.
And they decided, we're going to take the slow, long route and try to build up an audience. They took it to the road, and they went face-to-face with the fans, and they earned their respect one show at a time.
Well, we played every place and every night that we could. And I remember many times playing 2 shows a day, like playing like at a college outdoor festival in the afternoon and then playing a club that night.
The 1973 tour was exhausting, but it was paying off. Aerosmith's relentless show schedule was slowly earning them a fan base across the country.
The chemistry between Steven Tyler and Joe Perry was what was compelling people to come see these guys, to go back and tell their friends, next time you got to come with me to see these guys.
They were known for putting on a good show. I mean, Aerosmith were road warriors. They were a live band. They had swagger. They had soul.
Their loud, lusty hard rock especially struck a nerve with a specific group of rock fans.
They had this fan base growing, and they really played toward this working-class teenage crowd.
After a year of constant touring, Aerosmith was earning the audience their record label could not reach. Columbia relented and gave the band their second album. But would a new fan base translate into album sales? In 1974, the band released its sophomore effort, Get Your Wings.
So what happens is Get Your Wings comes out and it sells.
There were these fans who were waiting for an Aerosmith record, had seen them play, and wanted the reason to go buy an Aerosmith record. By the spring of 1975, Get Your Wings is a gold record, and now Aerosmith's in the big leagues.
When we came back to Boston, the record had broken here, and all of a sudden, we had gone from playing 200 or 300 people, we were playing to 2,000 people a night, and it was like mind-blowing.
From the summer of '74 onward, Aerosmith was slowly but surely gaining nationwide notoriety. But the strain of the steady travel and nightly performances was beginning to show, especially in the relationship between Joe Perry and Steven Tyler.
You really have two people who are almost like mirror images of each other. Tyler, the extremely flamboyant guy, who underneath that is actually kind of very musicianly. And you have Joe Perry, on the other hand, who's kind of quieter, much more soft-spoken, but who inside is this kind of like wild rock and roll guy. So this doubleness between them is part of what gives their creative relationship a charge, but it's also what kind of drives them crazy about each other.
From the beginning, this clash of personalities was kind of built into Aerosmith. These sort of little personality differences get amplified by this constant touring, by the repetition of it, the grueling part of it.
Also fueling the tension was Joe Perry's new girlfriend.
Around this time, Joe Perry started seeing a woman named Alyssa Jarrett.
She became very influential in the Aerosmith story because she had a lot of influence over Joe. She was always to be seen at the side of the stage, very close to where he stood.
Joe and Steven had been together writing and creating this band, and then Joe gets married and is very in love with Alyssa, and so they became a unit, and I could see that pulling Joe away from Steven. Steven lost a little bit of Joe to Alyssa.
As Aerosmith's career took off, infighting began to poison everything they'd achieved. But it wouldn't be the only toxic element to threaten Aerosmith. After 5 years together, Aerosmith had survived the failure of their first album by building a massive fan base through constant touring. And these fans demonstrated their loyalty where it mattered most. The band's second album, Get Your Wings, went gold. In April 1975, they released Toys in the Attic. Propelled by the now classic single Sweet Emotion, the album sold over 5 million copies. The boys from Boston were getting big and wealthy.
They were starting to appear on TV. They were starting to move out of clubs and theaters into hockey rinks and basketball arenas, and it was starting to get really big.
It was a big deal in '77 when an American band could sell 80,000 tickets at a place like the Silverdome in Michigan. There were not a lot of American bands doing it at the time. It was mostly British bands. So this was a huge deal for an American artist.
Suddenly you're living in better conditions. You're staying in better hotels, buy nicer guitars, buy your own car. Life's good.
I did a spread for Cream magazines called Stars Cars, and Joe and Joey had Corvettes and Steven. That wasn't his thing. He did have an airplane, though.
We used to have a ritual that we'd get paid in the smallest bills we could, and then we'd throw it all up in the air and just kind of wallow in it a little bit. And it went from being $300 to $3,000. And that ritual went on for quite a while until it started to be too much money to carry around. You know, we would have needed an armored truck. But as fast as it came in, it went out too.
Middle-class boys of Aerosmith could now afford all the luxuries of the rock star lifestyle, and its vices as well.
Throughout their rapid ascent in the 70s, Aerosmith was just surrounded by drugs, and drugs had always been associated with the band. Everybody knew about it.
One of Steven Tyler's classic trademarks is the scarf-draped microphone. And what most people don't know was that the scarves had a function that was beyond merely decorative. There were little pockets sewn in the bottom of them, and Steven kept drugs in the pockets of these scarves. It got out of hand. And this is when somebody in some media dubbed Steven Tyler and Joe Perry the Toxic Twins. And it stuck, this nickname, because it was so true.
Their drug use reached a new, more self-destructive level in 1977 when Aerosmith retreated to a former seminary in Armonk, New York, called the Cenacle, to record the album Draw the Line.
What I had heard about the recording sessions at the Cenacle was just that the guys were all really out of their minds and all off in different areas in their own rooms. The alcoholism and the addiction was so full-blown at that time.
We just brought all our toys up there and a lot of partying going on, and a lot of the focus wasn't on the music.
The music stopped being their passion and drugs started being their passion, which is the death of most great bands.
Aerosmith's excessive drug use was threatening to sabotage their fifth album.
They had writer's block. They were struggling. To come up with the tunes. I had some photos of Stephen and Joe side by side with a piece of paper. They just had their heads down like, we can't do it. We can't find it. And I think that was the lowest I ever saw them.
Joe and Stephen weren't the only ones disappointed. When Aerosmith finally delivered Draw the Line, the label and fans were unimpressed.
The Draw the Line album was months over schedule, and it didn't really have the same impact commercially or critically that the previous album did.
They went from being a great group to a good group that was clearly not in control of themselves.
Meanwhile, Joe's marriage to Alyssa was one of the factors continuing to drive a wedge between Aerosmith's two band leaders.
There were all sorts of feuds, but when the drugs are toxic, the behavior becomes toxic.
We were pretty burned out, and instead of taking the vacation, we let loose on each other.
And I think as the fame increased, drugs increased, and the issues between Stephen and Joe diminished the creativity between the two of them, the later 70s became a hard time.
Infighting and substance abuse were driving Aerosmith apart. Then, at a July 1979 concert, the band reached a crisis point.
It's July 1979. Aerosmith is in Cleveland. No one's getting along very well. People were grouchy. Everyone said the gig sucked. Backstage, after this gig, Joe's wife, Alyssa, got into it with Tom Hamilton's wife, Terry, and some milk was thrown. There was a battle that involved spilt milk, and Joe Perry walked out and left Aerosmith.
Kind of shows how ludicrous it was that it was actually over the cliche of the spilt milk.
Joe really perceived as the breaking point, the final straw, that now his wife was getting disrespected and that these guys just couldn't operate as a unit anymore. And after that show, he stormed backstage to Stephen's dressing room and they got into a big fight, and he said, "That's it, I'm done, I'm out of here." And Stephen said, "You should be out of here, this is finished, I'm never playing with you again." And, you know, everybody thought that was the end of the band.
Over nearly a decade, Aerosmith had risen from a scrappy Boston band to one of the hardest touring and most successful rock acts in America. But uncontrolled drug and alcohol abuse was destroying all they'd worked so hard to achieve. Then, on July 28, 1979, mounting friction with lead singer Steven Tyler led Joe Perry to quit Aerosmith, leaving fans and bandmates to wonder if the group could survive.
When we heard Joe Perry left the band, we thought that was the end of Aerosmith.
It's just not Aerosmith without Joe Perry.
People figured that the band would fall apart, but it didn't happen that way.
Surprising everyone, Aerosmith decided to carry on. Joe Perry was replaced with guitarist Jimmy Crespo in October 1979, but the magic was lost, and the fans were resistant.
People down front would be looking up at Steven Tyler and going, "Where's Joe?" And Steven Tyler got tired of this pretty quickly.
I didn't know that we could do it without Joe. Certainly didn't feel like we could do it.
Joe Perry leaving the band, for me, that was like, wait a minute, you gotta have Joe Perry in the band. It's like it's not having Steven in the band. It's just, to me, it wasn't Aerosmith.
The band that ended the 70s selling out 80,000-seat arenas seemed lost in the world of 80s rock.
They had slumped down to just playing the Orpheum Theater, which is 2,800 capacity, which is a long way from Boston Garden of, 18,000 and the stadiums that they played.
It was unbelievable to see how they had fallen from grace so quickly within a few years.
Steven was, I think, always sort of lost without Joe. I just saw him as suffering without that relationship.
Even without his toxic twin, Steven Tyler continued his heavy drug use.
They played a gig on a horrible night up in Portland. I think about 4 songs in, Steven was down on the stage.
He fell down right in front of me. I wasn't sure if he was alive. It was gut-wrenching.
And then Joe Baptista, the stage manager, came out and lifted Steven up with his arms and carried him off stage.
Things had just gotten bad. In 1980, Steven Tyler's on his motorcycle and he's wasted and the bike skids out of control. Trying to stop it, he rips up his heel and tears his foot up, and he's not able to perform. And being off of work for those 6 or 8 months just becomes the excuse to go deeper into the addiction and the abuse.
While Aerosmith was breaking down, Joe Perry had struck out on his own. In March 1980, his new band, the Joe Perry Project, released their debut album, Let the Music Do the Talking.
It was a great rock and roll band because Joe Perry was the lead guitarist, but it wasn't successful.
The Joe Perry Project still had Joe's groove, but it still needed to be him and Steven. There's something about those 5 original guys in Aerosmith. It's got to be the 5.
Fans rejected Joe Perry's Aerosmith spin-off, and the steady stream of money dried up. But Joe continued to indulge himself like a high-earning rock star.
Joe was heavily involved with drugs, and eventually, as happens with drug addicts, you start to lose parts of your life.
Joe Perry was creatively and commercially bankrupt. He began taking stock of his own life. By 1982, he had left his wife, Alyssa.
I had to get out of that relationship. I knew it was killing me. Once I walked out the door, I just felt so free. That was the start of getting a whole new perspective on things.
Joe started dating a young fashion model named Billy Montgomery. Their relationship blossomed. Surprisingly, Billy knew little about Joe's illustrious past.
She was part of the punk underground scene in Boston, but she didn't know anything about Aerosmith. And we were driving along in the car one day, and Back in the Saddle came on. And I said, "That's my guitar right there." And she said, "No, you're kidding me." So I turned the radio up and I said, "That's my band." So it was pretty easy for her to say, "Why don't you get back with these guys?"
To me, it just made sense. I mean, you played with them before, try it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. What do you have to lose?
Billy wasn't the only one pondering an Aerosmith reunion. The Joe Perry Project's manager was reaching the same conclusion.
So we played a gig in Boston, and after the gig, Joe had a friend, local disc jockey, Mark Parento, and he invited us back to his house to hang out. And Joe is passed out, so Mark starts playing all the old Aerosmith records. And I got excited. I started to feel the music. And Mark looks at me and he said, "Tim, you have brothers, right?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You fight with your brothers?" I said, "Of course." He says, "But you still love your brothers?" And I said, "Of course. Do anything for them." And he says, "Joe and Steven are brothers." It was at that moment that I knew it was meant to be.
In early 1984, Tim arranged a lunch in New York City between Joe and Steven.
The lunch was a little bit of reminiscing, a lot of complaining, and then at one point I said, "Guys, let's talk about the future and let go of the past." Steven looks at me and says, "He's right. I think it's time, Joe." And Joe says, "I do too." That was the beginning of it all.
More discussions followed, and gradually the rift between the old rock and roll allies was healed.
Joe Perry and Steven Tyler are smart enough to know that they were meant to be together.
The truth is, as great as Joe is, he's greater when Steven's out there in front of him, and Steven is much, much better when Joe is behind him.
Once we helped Steven and Joe make up, getting the other guys, it was pretty easy, because the energy had started, and they did not want to miss the train.
They decided to give it a shot, and I think that Steven's ego and just how his passion for rock and roll meant he wanted it back. He knew what they had lost, and he wanted it back badly enough.
The first band rehearsal happened in Glen Ellen Country Club.
We were all kind of nervous. Steven and I were excited to have the band back, all of us together under one roof, and it was like starting over. It was really a lot of fun.
I saw Joe that day as he went off to the rehearsal. For the first time since I met him, he had a smile on his face. And for the first time, I could see his eyes. The magic was there. He was back. He was Joe Perry from Aerosmith.
In May of 1984, Aerosmith regrouped under the guidance of new manager Tim Collins. All the original members took the stage together for the first time in 5 years on the aptly named Back in the Saddle Tour. The band was on the comeback trail, but it wouldn't be rock and roll that reignited their career. It would be hip-hop. After 5 years as one of the world's top-selling rock acts, Aerosmith had suffered a major setback. In 1979, as differences with frontman Steven Tyler mounted, lead guitarist Joe Perry abruptly left the band. The band languished for 5 years before Perry returned to the fold.
They went out and did a reunion tour, and they were still messed up, but they kept their act together enough to at least get out there on stage and deliver the hits. It only sort of reintroduced them, but it didn't really help them.
To make their comeback complete, Aerosmith needed a hit, but the 1985 album Done with Mirrors was a creative and commercial disaster.
Done with Mirrors died a very quick death, actually. I remember Aerosmith always did something splashy with the Boston media for any album opening. And this time they had a night, literally, at the castle on the North Shore. A beautiful, sumptuous kind of evening. And then they brought everybody into a side room. It was a listening party for the new album. And the whole room just went like catatonic, because that was a terrible record. And everybody's looking at each other like, is this the Aerosmith record, or is this some bad Motley Crue outtakes? Or, I mean, what is this? So we could quickly surmise that was not going to go anywhere.
What went wrong with Done with Mirrors is that Aerosmith was out of touch. They had been using drugs, they had been out of the world, they weren't in the mainstream of life when they did that record.
It only sold 320,000 copies, which for Aerosmith was nothing.
But Aerosmith's comeback wasn't faltering just because of one failed album.
When Aerosmith got back together, the music world had completely transformed. You'd had all of these kind of very colorful pop groups from England making colorful videos.
It was so important in that era to have a video out there. When MTV got behind a video in that period of time, 9 out of 10 times, that artist would go platinum at least. That's how powerful music videos were.
Without MTV exposure, any new Aerosmith release would be destined for the bargain bins. The band didn't just need a hit, they needed a music video miracle. In 1986, help came from a most unlikely place.
Run DMC were a rap trio from Hollis, Queens. Rick Rubin, the producer, was helping them by helping them pull pieces of rock and roll into the hip-hop world. Nobody had done that before.
Run DMC had been fans of Aerosmith for years. They just didn't know it.
We was in a studio, and we was like, yo, we need another rock song. So I was like, yo, Jay, I always loved Toys in the Attic. Yo, let's loop that. We're just gonna sample it. Rick Rubin walks in. And Rick Rubin sees me and Jay in the studio, and he hears the record, and he goes, yo, guys, do y'all know what that is? And me and Jay turn to Rick, and we're like, yeah, that's Toys in the Attic. He's like, nah, man, the name of that song is Walk This Way. The group is Aerosmith. And he goes to give us the 411 on Aerosmith. These guys were gods, rock gods, but they're not doing too good. And then Rick goes, yo, y'all should make the record over.
But at the time, covering a classic rock song was unthinkable for a young hip-hop act.
We had never heard the lyrics. So we go in the basement, we put the record on the turntable, and we let it play. He got on the phone, yelled, crying, this is hillbilly gibberish. We are not doing this. We'll never do this.
But producer Rick Rubin convinced Run DMC to give it a shot, and then he upped the ante. The rappers would do more than remake Walk This Way. They'd recorded in collaboration with Aerosmith to create a revolutionary rap-rock hybrid.
Run DMC's people call Aerosmith's people and they say, we're cutting Walk This Way, and we want Steve and Joe on the track.
It was really a smart move by Rick Rubin to have us come and play on it, but putting some electric guitars on the rap really made it accessible to more people.
Steven wanted to roll the dice because the music moved him.
On March 9th, 1986, Aerosmith met the young hip-hop act at Magic Venture Studio in Manhattan for an unusual partnership. The two groups were separated by musical style, age, and race. But when the music started flowing, Aerosmith and Run DMC quickly found common ground.
Got in there. Joe was on the guitar. Jay was doing a scratch. Joe did our verse. Steven went in and did his verse. And it was a rap. Truly amazing. Seemed like we've worked together forever. It just gelled together. It was amazing.
Released in May 1986, the single was a smash hit, eventually going gold. But the best was yet to come. That summer, MTV aired the music video for Walk This Way, which featured Steven Tyler and Joe Perry literally breaking down walls to perform with Run DMC.
I mean, the whole video was symbolic. It was like, you got these two powerful forces working against each other. Then they get so frustrated that they have to confront each other. And it just turns into a beautiful unity of, music.
Run DMC's cover version of Walk This Way quickly became the most requested and the most played video of MTV.
Walk This Way was really the beginning of the second coming.
All of a sudden, it was kind of the second generation of 9th and 10th graders who took one look at this and said, wow, who are these guys? So it was really the thing that launched their career into the stratosphere for the second time.
It was a marriage made in heaven.
Recharged by rap, the new version of Walk This Way hit number 4 on the Billboard Top 100, outperforming even the original version of the song. And for the first time in 10 years, Aerosmith was back in the top 40.
At this point, Aerosmith were relevant again in pop culture. I mean, they were a credible band again, but they still had the same problems.
The drugs had got completely crazy, totally out of control. In fact, I had to hire people to keep the drug dealers and all of the old friends who would be coming around just for bragging rights. So we had to just surround them with this army of security to keep them, basically to keep them alive. It was pretty wild.
And Tim committed to righting the Aerosmith ship. I called them the snowplow. The band is sort of in back of him and he's pushing away all the dope dealers that they have. It was an issue because they had a connection in every city.
Tim's efforts to curb the band's still heavy drug use were successful, at least to begin with. One night in Springfield, Illinois, a drug dealer slipped through his defenses.
And at one gig, it was Illinois, Steven got high before the show, and Steven slipped, fell off the stage.
Steven did a little too much of something that made him a little woozy on stage. He fell off the stage, and there was just pandemonium in the hall. And what happened next was I heard the paramedics say, "I think he's dead." And it was at that point that I went, I got to get a real expert to straighten this situation out.
Manager Collins knew he had to keep Steven Tyler away from drugs at all costs.
I did my own research on sobriety, and I got connected to this incredible man in New York, Dr. Lou Cox, and his specialty was interventions. Lou told me if they're hanging around with drug addicts, they're going to go back into the drugs. So I look him in the eye and I say, "You're trying to tell me that everybody's got to get sober?" And he goes, "That's what I'm telling you."
But that meant winning the support of another of Aerosmith's most conspicuous drug abusers.
I sat down with Joe and I said, "Joe, if you and I don't get sober, there's not a prayer that Steven's going to do it."
Talked about it for a while, and but I knew that something had to change. But my wife Billy was pregnant and closing in on the 9 months, and I said, "All right, I'll go away after my son is born because I want to be there for when he's born."
Joe was ready. He got some help. So that down, I had a partner again. It was Joe and I, and that's where it had all started for me.
After a decade of drug abuse, Joe Perry agreed to get clean. With his help, Tim Collins went about the arduous task of making the rest of Aerosmith drug-free, starting with Steven Tyler.
I call up Steven, and I say, "Steven, I need you in my office tomorrow morning at 7 a.m.
The band told him to show up early one morning to be interviewed by the BBC for an upcoming English tour. And Steven gets there at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the rest of the band is there. They've all got these legal-sized pads of paper in front of them. On the pads were written all the stuff that they didn't like about Steven. And they went around the table, and he realized that this was going to be an intervention, and he completely freaked out.
Most interventions take about an hour and a half, 2 hours tops. This one lasted about 10 hours, back and forth. It was so intense.
He was like, "What, me? You're all just as bad as I am. Why should I be singled out?"
And it took hours and hours and hours, and eventually he came around and he said, "All right, I'll go to rehab. I'll go tomorrow." And they'll go, no, Steven. We've got a bag packed for you. There's a plane waiting that's taking you off. to rehab.
Beleaguered and broken down, Steven Tyler flew to a rehabilitation center in Pennsylvania, where he would endure a grueling 45-day detoxification process. He emerged drug-free and determined to push his bandmates into rehab as well.
After Steven went to treatment, I knew the other guys would follow suit.
Tim Collins convinced them at the end of the day that they all had to be sober.
I knew they didn't have a choice. If they were going to be in Aerosmith, there's no way that Steven Tyler was going to let them stay in the band if they didn't follow suit. It's just the way the dynamics of the band worked.
The remaining members, Tom Hamilton, Brad Whitford, and Joey Kramer, soon followed Steven's lead. And for the first time in their 16-year career, the bad boys from Boston were drug-free.
Hey, this is Joe Perry.
And Steven Tyler from Aerosmith.
Clean and sober, they cranked out the album Permanent Vacation in the summer of 1987. Boasting hit singles like Angel and Dude Looks Like a Lady, it was a critical and commercial smash.
They had it back with Permanent Vacation. That was a record where it all was right again. And all of a sudden, wow, the magic is back.
My initial reaction to Permanent Vacation was that here's a band revitalized. I mean, they sounded fresh. They sounded like they were enjoying themselves again.
Not only did they make a great new record, but they were performing at the top of their game, better than they had ever played live. Steven was doing backflips on the stage. It was incredible to watch.
Aerosmith followed the success of Permanent Vacation with 1989's Pump, which delivered the hits What It Takes and Jamie's Got a Gun. Get a Grip arrived in 1993 with still more successful singles like Crazy, Cryin', and Amazing. Together, these three albums sold 19 million copies in the U.S. alone. Aerosmith's second act was overshadowing even their 70s heyday.
There was no one on their level as a hard rock band who could really even touch them.
In '94, they played Woodstock. In 2001, they played the Super Bowl halftime show. And they had all these really high-profile gigs.
They became a band that won Grammys, that won MTV Awards. They became professional. Aerosmith was the biggest band in America in the 70s for a long period and lost the throne. And then, miraculously, somewhere in the 80s, into the 90s, they regained that mantle. Very few people get that once. No one really gets it twice. So it's a remarkable achievement.
The people love Aerosmith. They love the rock and roll.
And Aerosmith has continued to churn out hits. Since beating back drug addiction in 1986, the band has released 6 platinum albums. In 2005, Joe Perry released a self-titled solo work that earned critical praise and a Grammy nomination. Still higher praise came when Aerosmith joined the ranks of their music heroes in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
I think the Hall of Fame was the most nervous I've been in my entire life playing. I was looking out there at Keith Richards and Jeff Beck, and I was a mess.
The fact that they're in the same place now, where the Rolling Stones are, where the Yardbirds are, in the course of rock history, you see them in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, they deserve to be there.
Things came to a screeching halt in March 2006 when the Hall of Famers were forced to cancel the remaining shows of their Rock in the Joint tour because Steven needed throat surgery. Then, 2 years later in February 2008, the band was introduced to a whole new generation of rockers with the release of guitar hero Aerosmith.
We have little kids coming up to us all the time asking us for this song and that song that they actually have no right asking about. I mean, songs from records from 20, 30 years ago. It's amazing.
Gaining new fans was never difficult for Aerosmith, but rocking out on stage, that wasn't as easy as it used to be. First, Joe fell and fractured his knee during concert rehearsals in January 2009. Then, that August, Steven broke his shoulder after falling off stage during a show in South Dakota.
Steven was dancing around and he fell off the stage. So I looked at him as he walked by and I said, well, looks like we're down again for at least another couple of weeks. As
Joe predicted, Steven's injuries forced the band to cancel the rest of their summer tour. This sparked rumors that Steven was quitting Aerosmith, which the lead singer later denied. During all the drama, a member of Aerosmith not often heard from, Joey Kramer, released his memoir, Hit Hard.
It's my journey, and I talk about living with an active addiction, alcoholism, depression, anxiety, how I came to lick it,
Addiction reared its ugly head again in December 2009. After struggling over the past decade to manage his chronic pain from numerous injuries, Steven entered rehab for an addiction to painkillers. After his release, Steven focused on his next career move, and a few months later, he announced that he was going to the last place you'd expect to find the 62-year-old Aerosmith frontman, American Idol. Steven joined Fox's hit show as a judge in August of 2010, and as a result, Aerosmith's sales went up 250%. In June 2011, it was time for Steven to tell his story in his own words. His autobiography, Does the Noise in My Head Bother You?, a rock and roll memoir, received interesting reviews. Like Steven's reputation, the book was described as wild, uncensored, and at times somewhat incoherent. In September 2011, Aerosmith gave their fans some long-awaited news. The band announced they were reuniting for their first studio album since 2004.
This record is too important. It's too much energy of the last 10 years that we had to lay down on tape, and who knows when we're going to do another one. So we figured we've got space for it. Let's do it.
To promote the upcoming album, Aerosmith hit the road with their global warming tour in May 2012. But only 5 shows into the tour, Steven was put on vocal rest by his doctors. That same month, after 2 seasons on the show, Steven announced he was leaving his mistress, American Idol, and returning to his first love, Aerosmith. Then, finally, as promised, Aerosmith released their 15th studio album, Music from Another Dimension, which featured a duet with American Idol winner, Carrie Underwood. In November of 2012, Steven went from staunch rocker to political activist. After he and his girlfriend were photographed at their home in Hawaii, Steven pushed for a celebrity privacy bill that would allow people to sue others who take photos or videos of their private moments. Known as the Steven Tyler Act, the bill got stuck in the island state's House of Representatives with little chance of moving forward. Aerosmith was dealt a serious blow in May 2013 when reality hit home, literally. When their hometown was in need of support following the Boston Marathon bombings, the band was first in line to lend a hand, headlining the Boston Strong Benefit Concert. With a career spanning over 4 decades, Aerosmith has weathered defections and drug addiction, not only to come back, but to become more popular than ever, ranking as the best-selling hard rock band of all time.
Aerosmith's been around for over 30 years. And they're still kicking ass.
And the fact that they turned their complete career around, that was going straight down, it was like a train going into a brick wall without any brakes, and to become one of the most respected and loved bands in the history of America. It's a pretty incredible feat. Aerosmith are truly one of the greatest American rock bands of all time.
Somebody's watching out for us, it feels like, a little bit, you know? Or maybe they just like the music as much as we do.
A lot of acts have broken up. Aerosmith still comes out like the Rolling Stones. They still play like adolescents. They connect with some sort of energy ball. They play excellent show after excellent show, and there's no reason to think it's going to stop now.